Good. Well, a very, very warm welcome to everyone. I see some familiar faces, others not so. I'll start very briefly by introducing myself, if I may. My name's Monica Bauman, as you can see on my screen. I'm the initiator and the director of the Insiders Outsiders project, which was devised, or in the first instance, to pay tribute and to explore in a more nuanced and detailed way than is usually the case, the tremendously rich contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture. And well, the festival itself was year-long, nationwide, finished, thank goodness, in March, or was due to finish anyway, in March 2020, somewhat curtailed, but not too badly. And then, by force of circumstance, actually a blessing in disguise, if I could put it that way, we decided to go online. And as some of you will be aware, we've been hosting a very rich, though I say it myself, a rich array of online talks on a whole variety of different subjects. But one thing I've been quite intent on doing, which seems a very natural sequel to the festival itself, was to give the descendants of creative individuals from that extraordinary generation of erstwhile refugees a chance to speak about their own experiences, often responding creatively, as is very much the case here tonight with Lydia, to being the children of refugee parents and their complex histories. And Monday evenings has tended to be indeed the slot that we've allocated for that. So Lydia's talk tonight is very much part of this kind of ongoing series. I'm just going to quickly admit a few more people. There we go. As I say, I'm sure you all know the ropes. If you would make sure that everybody's muted, I think everybody I can see so far is. And perhaps if you don't mind turning your video off in a minute so that we don't have any distractions on the screen, although of course you probably all know that speaker view is generally the recommended option. The chat, I think given the numbers attending tonight, will have questions coming through, questions and comments coming through the typed chat. But could you please make sure that you address them to me, Monica Bauman, not to everyone, because again, I think that tends to be rather distracting. The last thing I'd like to say before introducing Lydia is that it will be recorded, this event, and like virtually all the events under the Insiders Outsiders umbrella, the recording will be uploaded quite soon onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which you should take a look at if you're interested for past events as well. So if you don't want to be seen because it's being recorded, that's another reason for switching off your cameras. Very good. So it's now my very great pleasure to introduce somebody who I will say very much off the cuff is one of my oldest friends. I've introduced in the past year or so many people I know reasonably well, but I think Lydia and I go back more intimately for longer than I think we both care to remember. We were in early 20s at the Courtauld where we first encountered each other and had children at the same time, and so on and so forth. But I have to say, Lydia, this is the first time that I will be hearing you talk in any more detailed way, particularly about your mother. But let me just say a little bit about Lydia herself. She grew up in Poland, as many of you will already know, and she came to the UK with her parents and her sister, well, one sister, her twin sister, in 1971, after a brief 3-year stint living in Israel. She finished her schooling in Leeds and her higher education in 2 stages, first doing a degree in fine art and I think history of art together at Newcastle University, and then she did an MA in art history at the Courtauld. She's now based entirely in London, and she divides her time. She's one of these rare individuals who manages somehow to balance and indeed succeed in a twofold capacity, one as a practicing artist, and she has a lovely website which you can explore for yourselves, but also as an art history lecturer, a very accomplished one, I will say that straight away, mainly for adult or primarily for adult audiences, mostly at the National Gallery, where she has a regular slot, as it were, but also as a guest speaker for the Art Society and for various tour companies. And she has her own group with a rather endearing name, Art for the Uninitiated. And I'll just say, sort of lastly, before handing over to Lydia herself, that as I'm sure many of you will know, her father, Zygmunt, was a very, very eminent sociologist and philosopher, I think it would be true to say, and has had much attention, I think, focused on him over the years, both during his lifetime and since his death. But I think it's high time that we hear more about her remarkable mother, Janina, as well. So Lydia, it's my great pleasure to hand over to you.
Monica, thank you so very much, and thank you all for coming. Lovely to see many familiar faces and unfamiliar faces. Thank you for being here. Thank you, dear Monica, and let me just share my screen so we can proceed. I'd like to begin my talk with an image which I'd like you to perhaps have a look at for a little while and and just try to get the kind of feel of it. To me, it's a rather enigmatic image, not a straightforward family snap. What I'm referring to here is perhaps the expressions on the faces of these people. Of course, one of them is my mother in the middle, and the other two is myself on the left, and on the right is my twin sister, Irena. And I remember very clearly the occasion where this photograph was taken. I remember that I was next to my mother, and I remember her green jumper, which reflects the color of her eyes. I remember her Chanel No. 5 fragrance. But I also remember that just before the photographer took the photograph, she somehow recomposed herself and put on a certain face which was not quite familiar to me. I was surprised, and I was maybe even slightly embarrassed. I thought, well, why are you sort of putting these faces? As a child, I couldn't understand what that meant. As an art historian since, I've always been fascinated by the meaning of faces, trying to think about, how certain expressions express things or maybe hide things, how faces themselves reflect the history and the experiences of people. So, for instance, just two examples, Rembrandt and Goya, young portraits and old portraits, and clearly, as they lived through extraordinary times, the moment we know what befell them, the various disastrous and bereavements and tragedies, we understand that their life is etched on their faces, and that's what we see on them. We can begin to analyze them. But of course, self-portraits are self-portraits. They are between the painter and the reflection, and therefore they're not for other people's view, at least at that particular moment. That is not the case with a photograph taken. It's a very specific situation. And if I tell you now that this is a photograph taken in 1968 for the purpose of a one-way travel document out of Poland, to leave it, to emigrate, and never to exit us, basically, and never come back again, you might begin to understand the context and perhaps some of the feelings represented here. So I think in case of the two children, myself and Irena, it's obviously these are innocent kids, and they don't maybe express anything except their own particular personalities. But with my mother, she obviously was expressing something specific, or maybe hiding something specific. And shortly before this particular photograph was taken, on New Year's Eve of 1967, we experienced a shocking experience on television. Usually on those nights, there was New Year's Eve nights, there was a satirical program. We all sat down to watch it with the company of various friends, and to our horror, what came up on the screen was this rather horrendous caricature of how the Jews are taking over the world. That was really the first expression of what was actually, well, not the first, but for us children, it was the first expression of something very bad beginning to happen. And so I think what my mother's expression here is a response, which I'd like to analyze a little bit later, to those events, which led us to leaving the country forever, just a few months later in 1968. Now, I knew nothing about being Jewish, not much anyway. I remember my first experience of finding out about being Jewish was a few years earlier. I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, and I remember walking through the Polish countryside near Warsaw with my mother through a wood. And while we were walking, I found on the ground, on the path, I found what appeared to be a nice necklace, but it had a little cross on it. So I picked it up and asked my mother, well, what is this? And she said, oh, well, this is a rosary. And I said, well, what is it for? She said, well, this is something that Christian people use in the church. And I asked her, well, why don't we use it? And then this is the memorable thing. Even though there was absolutely nobody around, we were alone in the wood, just like in that scene here. She nevertheless lowered her voice almost to a whisper and said, this is because we are Jewish. She never explained, but she left me with a kind of dread of understanding that there was something deeply problematic about being Jewish. That's really the last I thought or heard of it, until another occasion, maybe a year or two before we left Poland, when my mother and I were visiting a doctor for something, and we were sitting in the waiting room, waiting to be admitted to the doctor's room. And to pass away the time, my mother began to tell me a story of her childhood in Poland. A very happy story it was. She told me about her mother, Alina Lewinson, that was their family name. Her father, who was a successful surgeon, Shimon, shown here in an operating theatre, just here. And she herself and her sister Sophie, or Zofia, as she was known. This picture is taken just after the war. It was an enchanted story of an almost magical, I think, sounding childhood. It was a family who was cultured, who was completely assimilated, who was fairly wealthy. It was memories of wonderful stays in the summer in the villa belonging to my mother's grandparents in Konstancin near Warsaw, a story of polished wooden floors and paintings and cooks and gardeners and nannies and governesses and culture, lots and lots of culture. And it was a fantastic kind of story. As she said later in her book, we were all Polish, born on Polish soil, brought up in the Polish tradition, permeated with the spirit of Polish history and literature. But she also added, yet Jewish at the same time, conscious of being Jewish every minute of our lives. And then, having painted this incredible picture of this rather rosy childhood, she said, and then the war came and everything came to an end. And just then the doctor's door opened, we were admitted, and I never heard the rest of the story. So again, that left me with incredible dread of what happened. What was that story? Well, that story eventually came to be written up in the book, which was part of the Beyond These Walls compendium, which was published later. Winter in the Morning, published in 1986 by Virago Press, which then became, was translated into many languages, extremely well thought of, and in fact eventually became a required reading for GCSEs here in England. The story itself was based on diaries and writings that my mother kept during the war, and they were very numerous. I'll show you one picture of that, written on any old scraps of paper in tiny handwriting, just in order to be able to use as much of the paper as possible. There was a shortage, clearly. The little numbers I've kept on there. All these different writings were confiscated at the time when we left Poland in '68, and so they were kept to this day in what is known as the Institute of National Remembrance. A kind of KGB kind of establishment, basically, where both my parents have bulging files. But she had it throughout the war, just before the end of the war, when she could no longer carry them, but there were quite a few. She buried them when she was moving to the next place of hiding. She buried them under the floorboards of an abandoned flat. She came back after the war to collect them, and they were still there. Half of the building was missing. The piano leg was hanging over the precipice, but they were still there under the floorboards. Quite a few of them, in fact, all of them have got a print, a stamp across the page. You'll see them a bit more clearly in a minute. These denote the fact that they were they're still kept by this Institute of National Remembrance. I will go through them, and while I go through them, I'll tell you a little bit about the content. And I kept the numbers to show you how many there are. So these are both diaries She was between the age of 13 and 18 at the time, of 19 during the war. They're both diaries of everyday events. They are also short stories, they are poems. And they are extraordinary. They're hard to read because her writing is not very legible. And they tell the extraordinary story of how, when the war began, that her father left them immediately to fight, to be engaged in the war. It was only after a while, after they escaped the ghetto, that peeling potatoes in a peasant woman's home over a newspaper, she learned that from a list in the newspaper that her father was actually killed in the Katyn massacre. But there were stories of extraordinary variety. There was an extraordinary kind of panorama of colorful and amazing people, mostly women actually, who helped them to get through the war. Either through the kindness of their heart or for more mercenary reasons, all beautifully observed. They were literally diaries of a girl who was coming of age, who was experiencing her first love, who was trying to lead as normal a life as possible, even while experiencing the horrors of the ghetto, Warsaw Ghetto, and the kind of hell that was going on around her. These are the stories that she then had to recollect from memory, because they were still in that institute in Warsaw. We have only received these scans much later. It was by remembering them from memory that she eventually sat down in the 1980s, in her late 50s, in Leeds, where we finally came here, to write up those stories into the book, Winter in the Morning. It was having finally written it, she finally got rid of the nightmares that she used to have at night and began to, it was an incredibly cathartic experience. But in the introduction to the book, she writes the following. During the war, I learned the truth we usually choose to leave unsaid, that the cruelest thing about cruelty is that it dehumanizes its victims before it destroys them, and that the hardest of struggles is to remain human in inhuman conditions. So what is this struggle to remain human? What is inhuman about the conditions, and what kind of stages one goes through to get to that stage of being dehumanized? And my mother, in her many extraordinary stories in the book, which sound more like fiction than truth, because you simply can't imagine how she could have really survived the things that were happening to her at that time, the dangers and the risks that she was taking. I identified from those pages 3 scenes which, to my mind, express the stages in which somebody can become dehumanized. So I think the first stage is when we are deprived of our ordinary everyday parameters of life, the kind of comforts of ordinary life, the usual assumptions and expectations. And I've chosen to demonstrate that a scene where she she leaves the place of her, she's in the ghetto, she leaves the flat she's staying in, the place, a hovel where she's staying, and she is looking for bread. She's going to a bakery, which was operational at that time. And you might like to perhaps compare it to your own experience of going to a bakery to get your own provisions, whatever it is that you buy normally for your breakfast. And this is what she says: my way to the baker's led through a labyrinth of cellars and underground corridors. I felt my flesh creep as we descended into the dense shadows of this underground world. Moving very slowly, often on our hands and knees, we often came across strange objects blocking our way. Once I bumped into something soft and wet, which could have been just a pile of rotten straw. Once I stepped onto a dead cat. Sometimes we had to climb over a barricade of old cases of furniture, barring the way. A weird rustle nearby would make me shiver. There were rats scurrying in the darkness. This is already pretty much removed from your ordinary kind of life, is it not? The second stage of perhaps becoming dehumanized is to get used to it and to, in fact, accept the horrors that are around you. And the next detail, the next passage is this one. I remember my second winter in the ghetto as a time of weird stability. I somehow learned to live with evil claiming its victims all round, with the tide of misery lapping my doorstep. I took it for granted, like summer heat or winter frost. I was not the only one to live like that, but if I blame others, I should first of all blame myself. And the third stage, to my mind, is the one where the victims begin to think like the oppressors, just simply out of their need, obviously they need to survive, desperation to survive. And in this passage, my mother describes the time when she was in the various stages of her ghetto life. She was at that point living in a much narrowed area of the ghetto, which was becoming smaller and smaller and shrinking all the time. And it was a place in which only people who had a special permission to stay there could stay there. Those who didn't have the all-important registration card with a number, they were known by the ghetto slang as wild, living wild. And these people were people who were useful to the Nazis. Everybody else already went off, was already deported to the camps. It's people who were still useful to the Nazis who could stay there. So, hospital workers, Jewish police, members of the Jewish Council to keep order, and people who worked for the German factories as well. So they were allowed to stay, and of course, unless you had a proof that you were supposed to be there, you would be simply deported or just shot on the spot. So they only had one of those cards between them because one of her uncles, she had many, one of her uncles who had some connections, in fact, he worked for the Jewish police, he was able to get one of sorry, so I don't know how much you heard.
Lydia, sorry to interrupt, I'm really sorry. I'm trying to mute everyone, but of course I'm muting you as well. So sure. I'm going to mute everyone and then you need to unmute yourself.
Sure, okay.
Yes, apologies, and if you want to just backtrack just a few minutes.
That's fine. So I was saying that these all-important permission cards to stay in this particular part of the ghetto, one of them was arranged by my mother's uncle, Julian.
Oh.
Jewish police, and there was one registration card between them for my mother's mother, my grandmother, but not for the two girls, not for my mother and her sister, and yet they had to move places, and they had to come out in the open, and therefore could have been easily discovered. And as they were walking in this column of people, 5 by 5, spread on by the Nazis, this is what happened. Remember, the mother, my grandmother has got this all-important orange piece of paper with the permission number on her, while the two girls are supposedly wild. And this is what happens. She says, "Look, there are two wild girls among us." A sharp, hysterical voice suddenly rang out behind me. I turned around, frightened. A well-dressed, intelligent-looking woman in her 40s was staring at me with indignation from the line behind. "They have no right," she said to mother. "Innocent people may die instead of them." So the point I'm making here is that the way that my mother describes her, well-dressed, intelligent-looking woman in her 40s, sounds like she's absolutely part of the same kind of milieu as her own family. And yet, in her desperation to survive, she's essentially taking the side of the Nazis and regarding them as already no longer innocent and not deserving to live. And I think that's perhaps the kind of final stage of being dehumanized. So how did my mother survive the war and resist this extraordinary process, which did deprive people quite often of their humanity? And I think one of the ways that she did that, she tried very hard against all odds. She decided she tried very hard to maintain the kind of cultured life that they used to have in her childhood. This extended to taking part in secret private lessons at home with tutors. There were plenty of people to give lessons. It extended to taking great care of her personal appearance, sometimes to the extent of being quite vain, which is quite incongruous in that particular setting. But she was a young teenager coming of age. And it also took the form of reading a lot, actually, just sinking herself into literature, great literature, actually. And these books were often found just by pilfering, going around abandoned flats, places that people who have already been deported left behind. She said, I quickly got used to poking about in dead people's homes and even learned to find pleasure in it. I knew that corruption had found its way into my soul and did not care a damn. And yet what she did manage to find and read clearly kept her very, very much sane at that time. I found amongst her notes that she left behind a list of books, which I'm not sure whether this is a list of books set by her private lessons, in her private lessons during the time in the ghetto, or whether just books that she wished to read. But if we look at the list, you will see that they contain all the all the experience of the world and of life in them. So even in the extraordinary confines of ghetto life, the restricted way of living, she could have had at least an insight into how life maybe could be or should be. So, for instance, just reading down the line, Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain, Joseph Roth, Zipper and His Father, Job, The Story of a Simple Man, James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Louis Benaros under Satan's Son, Hermann Hesse. So you can see that all these authors are to do with identity, coming of age, soul searching, about morality, about religion, about spirituality, all the important, great, big, extraordinary subject of life that she was taking in by reading this literature. And then Eugene Morin, Black Magic and Living Buddha, this takes her to the sub-Saharan desert of Africa. So it gives her broad horizons of faraway places, even while she's being stuck in some hiding place in the ghetto. Upton Sinclair, Oil and King Cole. This is about inequality of workers, the exploitation of people, also very, very important. John Erskine, The Private Life of Helen of Troy, the first feminist novel. So again, very important lesson to be learning. Hemingway, Farewell to Arms. Stefan Zweig, The Case of Sergeant Grisha, and these are books about the futility of war. You couldn't really wish for better literature. And part of the effect of reading so much is that she also began to write herself. She recalled, and I'm showing you that particular page from her writings during the war. This is all written in Polish. She recalled how on one occasion, when hiding in the ghetto, staying in some place, she listened to a witness's account of something that they have witnessed, and she was moved to actually writing it down to make it into a story. It's a story of how just the witness account was about people being rounded up and taken to the so-called Umschlagsplatz, which was the place in Warsaw where the Nazis were collecting all the Jews from carefully chosen places and loading them onto trains and taking them to Treblinka. And this story which she described, I've got the book here in front of me, the story that she describes is a particular scene that she had from a witness. And this is how it goes. A lonely teenage boy was caught up in a roundup and dragged to the Umschlagplatz together with a crowd of screaming, lamenting people. The boy did not scream, but walked silent, aloof, holding his only property, a violin. In the Platz, swollen with human misery, resounding with cries, shots and hoots of the train leaving for the gas chambers of Treblinka, he was noticed by Commandant Brandt, the chief of the Umschlagplatz, well known for his cruelty, as well as for his occasional fits of benevolence that sometimes saved people's life. This time Brandt was in just such a mood. He stopped the boy and ordered him to play. An uncanny silence at once superseded the uproar. People huddled together to make room for the field grey uniforms that pushed their way through the crowd, eager for entertainment. In the middle of the little clearing, the slim, pale boy with the violin shivered from fear in front of the bulky Nazi. For a while, he could not bring himself to start. His fingers trembled. Then suddenly he played. It was a subtle, inspired music, which sounded like a prayer, like a mighty call for help to God himself. The condemned and the butchers held their breath. They all believed the life of the gifted child was going to be saved. The boy knew it too and smiled. He finished with rich, powerful chords of thanksgiving. There was silence again. The boy waited, the listeners waited. Commandant Brandt stood numb, spellbound, raising himself. He glanced at his watch and pointed at the boy. Same time tomorrow, he said with a spark of amusement. He'll play in Treblinka. And as if to himself, he added, pity. So this is all written here. And I would just like to say that if you compare the writing, which has only just come to light relatively recently, the way that my mother described it raw in the actual writing as soon as she heard the story, and also having experienced a lot of things herself, there's a big, there's a big difference between that immediately experienced story than the one that she eventually wrote in the 1980s in the book. I'd like you just to compare some of the words that she was using in her writings during that time. So she was saying things like the courtyard was, to describe the situation, the courtyard was a seething, writhing mass, house of despair, shrill whistles, sounds of blows and flogging, lament and hysteria, wailing, sobbing. She spoke of the darting, crazed eyes, and then those mouths screaming until they could scream no more. She spoke of the crowd in the courtyard as a grey living substance, trembling in the paroxysms of an animal death fear. And all this becomes translated in the book as these words: in the Platz, swollen with human misery, resounding with cries, shots and hoots of the train leaving for the gas chambers of Treblinka. So I think it's much anesthetized, I think, by the workings of memory and time. Or about the boy playing. This is what she wrote at the time. Violin notes rose melodiously high above the place of execution, high above the butchers and their victims, and flowed, cascading in a stream of tremulous tones of a mighty song. It was a supplication for life itself and a prayer for those dying in agony and a curse on their persecutors. Well, in the book, the passage I just read to you, it came out as it was a subtle, inspired music which sounded like a prayer, like an almighty call for help to God himself. And then he finished with rich, powerful chords of thanksgiving. So the point I'm making is that there is a great difference between the actual original writings and what might be, evoked so long afterwards. Writing which, I know for a fact was written between breakfast and drinks before lunch. So there's, things change with time. Okay, so my mother also began to write poetry, and I discovered in those documents 40 poems written by her between the age of 16 and 19. I wrote them out and even translated one of them. Let me show you one of the poems. I'll just read it to you in Polish because it's got a certain melody which is worth hearing. So this is called Pieśń jesienna. I'll give you the translation in a minute. And it goes like this. Jesienna ulewa, coś huczy, coś śpiewa. Wiatr deszczem zawiewa strugami. Złowieszczo, ponuro, deszcz hula z wichurą. Zaciąga się niebo chmurami. Coś huczy, coś wyje, o szyby deszcz bije. Za oknem mrok gęsty się snuje i spełza w głąb duszy, a wichru śpiew głuszy głos smutku, co w sercu kiełkuje. And that's written in November 1944. I'll give you a couple of translations because there's obviously a problem also with the beautiful evocative Polish language having to be contained and somehow changed and shaped by the possibilities of English language, obviously in itself very rich, but it's not quite the same to have something translated. So one translation goes like this. Autumn rain, it's called Autumn Song, autumn rain pouring, now sighing, now roaring, now dancing along with the wind, forbidding and dreary this element's fury, and the sky standing dark with night's ink. Something rumbles, something wails, rain beats against the window panes, dusk thickens slowly outside, creeping deep into soul's recesses, while the song of the storm represses a small voice of sadness, softly stirring within. That's one translation, and the second translation that done by myself and my sisters. The other one goes like this: the autumn rain pouring, now sighing, now roaring, wind chases and pushes the rain, forbidding, abhorrent, rain dances with torrent, clouds color the sky with grey paint. Now wailing, now calling, hits window while falling, with thickening darkness day goes, as heart sinks, dusk pushes, wind deafens and hushes, melancholy's soft budding woes. All of her poems have as a frame the window, most of them. Her entire experience of being in the ghetto, even afterwards when she escaped finally and spent the rest of the war hiding in the countryside with people who were willing to give her and her sister and her mother shelter, was always in hiding. And the frame of the window almost provides like a frame of a painting. They're quite painterly. Unfortunately, neither of these translations really expresses, I think, adequately the kind of the poetry of the original. So great sensitivity to nature, love of nature, and a lot of obviously melancholy. There's lots of grayness, lots of rain, lots of clouds, but beautiful sensitivity to nature, and clearly a great longing for freedom, lack of hope that she will ever escape the situation, and as well as various romantic poems for various boys that she still managed to fall in love while going through all this. Eventually, obviously, the war came to the end, and there's another little fragment I'd like to show you, which is a record of her shortly after the war, walking in the countryside. This is the text here. Those of you who know Polish might be able to read it. Walking in the countryside by a river in a beautiful sort of silent place, in the company of an unnamed person. I don't know who that person was, a young man, I think. And this is what she said, and again, it's translated here. And then for the first time in my life, it occurred to me that I was happy. It happened suddenly and was remarkable in its simplicity. Out of the woods, the fields, the setting sun, happiness rose and entered my soul, signaling that it has arrived. It was here. It was a quiet happiness, peaceful, like the swaying of trees and the sounds of the evening. And this segues directly into my mother's second book, which she wrote 2 years later in 1988, called A Dream of Belonging, my years in post-war Poland. She came back from the war to Warsaw in rags to find it completely demolished. You can see Zygmunt's column here, one of the kings of Poland, in this picture here. The royal palace was completely destroyed. She herself, you can see here in the picture, helped to rebuild Warsaw, and indeed Warsaw was rebuilt by an incredible, extraordinary effort. in the matter of just a few years. The old city, old town, completely razed to the ground, stood again, based on old engravings and documents. So that was extraordinary. And of course, having emerged from the essential, the time when she was so powerless, and all she could ever do is just while away her time in hiding, while she was really very, very keen to do something useful, and that she couldn't. She emerged from the war absolutely full of ambition to do something useful, to do something significant with her life, full of energy and hope. She soon met the man that became her husband. She described the meeting in the book. They used to both attend some free university lessons available to people shortly after the war in Warsaw. And she described the moment when they've already been eyeing each other from a distance for quite a while, sometime. And then one day she came in very early to the auditorium, and it was completely empty. He came in shortly afterwards, came right up to her and asked her, "Is this seat taken?" in a completely empty auditorium. He proposed to her 9 days later, and they married in 18th of August of 1948. He was, as you can see, somebody who had a military career, which was a quite distinguished career. He was cut short because he was Jewish, maybe just as well, because he then took up sociology instead. And they, between them, embraced this whole notion of building a new Poland, creating a new Poland. The answer to that at that time, the best answer that was available, was communism. The only other option was fascism. And they both embraced that with very, very passionately. I don't know exactly what this particular event is, but here are my parents, my father, my mother, and they are marching and shouting and looking happy. I'm sure that these flags are red, and I'm sure it's something about the 6-year plan and the importance of being good citizens and following the communist ways of running the country. So it was a time of great promise and great energy. They soon had 3 children. So that's my twin here, myself and my older sister, Anna. And they had a very, very engaged, interesting, and I assume happy life, judging by some of the photographs of that period. Very deeply engaged politically, very busy with their respective, MAs, PhDs, my father's side anyway, and then the children, looking after children. The conditions, of course, were very difficult in post-war Poland to do all that, but you can see that there was a tremendous sense of belonging and feeling very much part of a greater cause. My father was developing his career at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw as a sociologist, lecturer, and writing books and discussing politics and changing things, or trying to change things for the better. My mother began a career in the Polish film industry. Her job was to look at scripts and make comments whether they are worth producing or not. In that capacity, what passed through her hands were scripts such as Andrzej Wajda's Ashes and Diamonds, Man of Marble, and Canal. It has to be said that she was, because the party had kept a very careful eye on every aspect of work in Poland and wanted to be sure that everybody toes the party line. They practically were using her to be a censor. She didn't actually realize that at all. She was expressing her own views. If something was good, she would say it was good. If it wasn't, it wasn't. But she did say about the Man of Marble that it was a little bit too bleak an image of life in Poland to actually be suitable to be made a film of. And even though it wasn't her definitive decision, but someone else's, a superior, that's why that particular film remained unmade for quite a few years. And then there's also Polanski, Knife in the Water. So all that was very much her career. It was very, very engaging, very, very interesting. But she became aware after a while that that the party which she became a member of, like my father was, were essentially using her. They wanted to, they wanted to make her into an agitator for the sake of building a greater Poland. They wanted to be sure that everybody, that she should tell people, how important the communist principles are, socialist principles are, and to that end she was asked to keep a little notebook recording all the conversations that she had with people, both formal and informal, in which, for instance, this is described in the book, she described how her very good friend and co-worker in the film industry was telling her how she was not very happy because she couldn't get any nylon stockings in the shops, clearly at the time. And this, suffice to say, led to the dismissal of this woman because she was she was regarded to be, somebody who was more interested in Western values, and that was the reason behind the dismissal. So these are the kind of lessons that my mother was learning while trying very hard to do the right thing and be a good human being and useful to the country that she, after all, loved quite a lot. But she did warn in her book that power corrupts, and it insinuates itself into every aspect of people's lives without even them being aware of that. So this, nevertheless, she was regarded as a very great worker, and there's plenty in our archives, family archives, to show that. One example here is a book which I have, which was given to her by her workplace comrade Janina Bauman, during the International Days, Women's Day. She is given this prize for good results in her both professional and social work. Something else is a pin which I have and quite like, saying Przodownik Pracy, which basically means a leader employee, or a kind of pioneer of labor, or something like that. So again, to recognize her great efforts and usefulness in her workplace. But doubts began to occur to her. She clearly, after the 1956 revelations about Stalin, everybody was obviously, scales fell off many people's eyes. My father, obviously, my father too. They became rather disillusioned by the way that the government, the party, Polish People's Republic Party, United Workers' Party, it was known at the time, interfered with people's lives. This came to a head in 1968, especially with the Six-Day War in Israel, where the notion of the Zionist arose. Basically, everybody who supported Israel's victory and congratulated them was a Zionist. This became a byword for basically for Jews. Quite often there is a lack of distinction between the two, and other problems brought things to a head. On that particular occasion, the then party leader Gomułka said that the Jews were like a fifth column. They began to be distrusted. He began to seed, to kind of sow the seeds of distrust, always under the surface anyway. That wasn't very difficult to achieve. And then there were other events, such as the unrest by students, which was caused by the staging in the National Theatre of a famous classic from Polish literature, written by the kind of Polish bard Adam Mickiewicz, a great big epic called Forefathers, or Dziady, which was written during the partitions, and in which it was very clear that he speaks against the Tsarist regime and the various oppressors that divided Poland. It was meant to be used by Polish people as a patriotic example and give them, hope and resilience to put up with oppressors. But in this particular climate, it was seen as a statement against the Soviet Union, under which, of course, Poland was, whose family, Poland clearly was at that time. And so any students or anybody who went to see that play was suspected of having those sort of affiliations. Suffice to say that the play was taken off the stage after only 13 performances, and this is what led to the extraordinary bursting out of demonstrations and expressions of discontent amongst the students. They were fighting for the right of speech. They were fighting for lack of censorship. They were fighting for equality between people, at everything you can possibly, and of course the all important stirrings of antisemitism in a socialist party which was all about equality and everybody being equal. So the university staff, my father amongst them, clearly were behind the students' activities, protected them. And very soon afterwards, in 1968, Gomułka, the first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party, on the 18th of March, gave a speech which we all watched on television. I can remember it very, very well to this day. The photograph is as grainy as my memory of that event, but I do remember it very clearly because in this speech, he basically denounced Jews as being Zionists. His particular words, which my mother wrote in her book, were as follows: without a doubt, a category of Jews exists who are Polish citizens, yet who feel emotional and intellectual allegiance to the state of Israel rather than to Poland. We are ready to grant immigration passports to those who consider Israel their homeland. And then she says there was a pandemonium in the auditorium, an outburst, applause ensued. At once, now, today, the audience roared, the assembly turned into a raging mob. And this clearly gave a license to the general people in Poland, the working people, the peasants, the workers, a signal that they should rise up against the enemy, which is the Jew. So it was very much a government-inspired anti-Semitic sort of drive of that time. And you can see some of these people holding placards saying, Zionists go to Israel, hooray to Władysław Gomułka, remove adventurers from the academia, things like that. My father's name was mentioned often together with 4 other academics, professors, who were all dismissed from the university soon afterwards, all of them being Jewish. So that's my parents just before that event. My mother writes in the book the whole description of how things went on from then on. We were, I'm showing you the house we lived in on this long street. This was the place where we're now being followed by some, employees, apparatchiks of the party. We were, our friends were being followed. At school, me and my sister were being persecuted by people who used to be our friends, who would repeat after the parents. They would repeat slogans such as "Go to Israel." Our apartment was completely bugged. It's on the 3rd floor, somewhere here. Men would come into the flat on the pretense of repairing a telephone, which had nothing wrong with it, and in fact put in some kind of listening apparatus. So things became very sinister and very, very difficult. We were always followed wherever we went at a long distance. Everywhere we went, we were followed at a distance. My mother describes, and I remember very well, that in order to make it a little bit more cheerful for me and my sisters, he would play tricks on the grey men behind us in the grey coats by going round the roundabout 3 or 4 times, and they had to do the same, or entering a cafe and ordering cakes. Those two would follow us and order also cakes, and the minute they did, we would get up and leave. Things like this. It was a childish thing, but eventually it became clear that with the permission, or the insistence of the government, that all the Jews should really leave Poland. That's exactly what we decided to do, because both my parents lost their jobs. They gave in their party cards. We had nothing to live on. We literally had about 4 months savings to remain in Warsaw. So the decision was taken to do that, to leave. And again, my mother describes, and I remember it very, very well, that when the permission finally came, we were already packed because we were expecting it. The permission, we had to give up our passports for that, but to receive permission to leave and travel, we had to declare that we are going to Israel. So that's what we declared, although it wasn't necessarily true. We were not entirely sure, my parents were not entirely sure where we were going. But because our flat was bugged, there was no guarantee that we would not be still stopped on the way, especially because there was a policeman living underneath us on the second floor and made our life a complete misery, particularly to my older sister Anna, who at the age of 18 was already, having friends round and to quietly, talk, discuss things, and he would sometimes, on one occasion, he had them arrested for disturbances. So it was very important to leave secretly. So we never spoke. It was never spoken when we would leave. But on the day which we thought preceded our leaving, on the night at 2 o'clock, my parents woke us up, and I remember we tiptoed down and we literally pushed the car out of this side street not to wake with the engine noise, not to wake that policeman. We jumped into it and we drove. And by 6 o'clock in the morning, we were on the border with Czechoslovakia, incidentally seeing Russian tanks moving down the motorways. And so just to come back to this picture once more, let's just maybe, in view of what you've had so far, my mother's story, this photograph was taken as part of the document which signaled our departure forever from Poland. What she could have felt on that occasion would have been perhaps any number of things. Could have been anger, it could have been resentment, could have been hate, could have been bitterness, it could have been fear. But I think that the way that she kind of composed her face on that occasion, just sort of thrusting her chin forward and just slightly raising that eyebrow, I think what she actually managed to convey to those who would ever look at this picture again was that sense of dignity which she learned to have throughout her life. And that's perhaps what I would like to think that picture actually shows. Just as a kind of addendum, 50 years after the events of March 1968, when we left Poland, the Poland Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, incidentally built exactly where we lived in Warsaw, which in turn was built on what was the ghetto during the war, staged an exhibition called Obcy w domu, which means stranger at home, which analyzed and fleshed out all the events which led to that emigration of 13,000 Jews from Poland in 1968, those events that led to that. And in that exhibition, a section was devoted to the departure of the Bauman family from Warsaw. And this is myself, I took my children there to show them that exhibition that was ready in 2018. And all the images here and all the wording accompanying these images were taken from my mother's words from her second book. The book was eventually, 2 books were eventually published under one title, Beyond These Walls. And I'd like to complete the finish now, but just quoting from the second book, A Dream of Belonging, at the very, very end, a kind of postscript, where my mother describes living already in Leeds, because we only stayed in Israel for 3 years, and we came to Leeds in 1971. And she described one of the walks that they used to take into the Yorkshire Dales around Leeds, somewhere in the countryside. And this is what she says in the very last paragraph of that book. That's them together. And this is what she says: dawn comes over the Yorkshire moors. With a mild breeze comes the promise of a fine day. Alone under the vast dome of a brightening sky, we walk through the spellbound waste. The light, the scent, the sound of early morning brings back memories of another life, another country. I left that country in the distant past, abandoning all my young hopes and passions. Now I belong nowhere, but perhaps to belong means to love and be loved, and this is all that truly matters. So, thank you. Monica.
Lydia, thank you so very, very much. I'm sure we all have a lump in our throat and a tear in our eye at that conclusion. As fully anticipated, that was hugely eloquent, intensely moving, and also very, very fascinating, unfamiliar territory, at least some of it for some of us. Do you want to stop screen sharing, Lydia? Sorry, that's partly why I went silent for a minute. So we can see you better.
Okay.
Lovely. And I will now take a look at the chat. I know there were some questions coming in. Hold on a second. Right. Fine. Do keep the questions coming. It often happens at the last minute. Right. Lots of appreciative comments, as you can imagine. Yes, some specific questions. Let's start with these. Yes. Was your mother's political involvement a result of her wartime experiences, or had her family been politically engaged before the war?
No, they were not particularly engaged at all. I mean, as I mentioned, they felt themselves completely Polish and assimilated. There was, they led very happy and settled lives. But it was the experience, as I mentioned, of her forced idleness during the war that powered her up and fired her up to do something useful. And of course, Poland really did have to be rebuilt. It did have to function somehow. It was completely in ruins. So many lives were lost, and it was her fervent wish to bring it back to something of the way it used to be. Of course, it was never quite the same since. But no, so that hence she was not a political person, not in the way that my father was, certainly in his writings, even though he wasn't quite politically engaged, but he was very much interested in the way that society functioned. But no, it was just the effect of the circumstances after the war that led her to embrace a very committed stance towards how Poland could be run. I hope that answers the question.
Indeed. A number of questions pertaining to sort of the later stages of your parents' lives. From Yona, I think it is. What were your parents able to do in Israel and later in England? Perhaps you to say a brief word about that.
My father was, well, the reason we went to Israel, although he had other offers of other positions at universities and various places, but Israel it was because we had family there. My mother preferred to go somewhere vaguely familiar. My father took on the post of the Department of Sociology at the University of Tel Aviv. My mother worked in a daily newspaper archive. Obviously, her experience with the Polish film industry was not transferable in any way. She had to take on something else, which at least vaguely connected with writing, perhaps, and reading. So that's what she liked. They were deeply disillusioned by Israel. They felt that they left one oppressive country to enter another, where this time it was the Jews who were oppressing another people, namely the Arabs. My father didn't wish to be a professor in a place where students were, soldiers first and foremost, and only studied as and when they were allowed to. So we left, and by which time my father had offers of other employment, of other university posts. There was choice at that point between Canberra and Leeds, and they chose the old world for the new. I think they wished us, the girls, to become ladies. My older sister Anna stayed in Israel because she was by then already pretty grown up, and her Polish boyfriend, in fact, who was locked up in a prison for taking part in those disruptions, those demonstrations, student demonstrations, and didn't even know we were leaving. Nevertheless, tracked her down and followed her, and they're happily married to this day. So that's in short what they did.
And I'm going to ask you to answer this one very, very briefly as well. It could be a lecture in itself, from somebody called Eileen Martin. And actually, no, sorry, that's actually a separate comment from Julie Halls. Yes, I wondered what your father's experience was while your mother was enduring life in the ghetto.
Oh, he was, yeah, he fled to the east with his parents. He then, there was only 1 year's difference between them. She was 13 when the war started. He must have been 14. They spent a time in Russia in terrible deprivation. He then joined the Polish section of the Russian army, and stormed Berlin and all that stuff. Was wounded. He had a career in front of him in the military, but it didn't happen, as I mentioned. So they only met after the war, as I also mentioned. Yeah.
At least one question, Lydia, about the Jewishness, particularly of your mother's family. Clearly, she was very conscious. I think you quoted her as saying, "I was conscious of being a Jew every minute of our lives pre-war," and yet in your growing up, it barely featured. Do you think it was? What do you make of that?
I think it's true for a lot of Jewish people that if they are assimilated into a country, they feel that they are part of that country. It is a very secular upbringing that we had in terms of the Jewishness. I only learned about Jewish holidays when I went to Israel, to my great shame, because of course they were marked there. So yes, I think it's something we feel that we are, but it's very difficult to put one's finger on it. And perhaps one reason why my mother never explained when she lowered her voice and said, because we're Jewish, when I found that rosary, was that it was probably an impossible task to explain what it meant to be Jewish. How could you explain that to a child, anyone really, what it means to be Jewish? It's such an ethereal thing, isn't it?
Don't you think it's partly also a wish to protect your children, partly yourself, but also your offspring? It's a big question. I'll leave it as an open question. Yeah.
I flashed up the photograph of me with my 2 children, Carl and Sophia, and they are only partly Jewish. Well, they're Jewish because I'm Jewish, but their father isn't. And they, yes, I mean, being Jewish is somewhere there in their consciousness, but it never played the part that obviously it played in my mother's life, or indeed in mine. It never made them to change the course of their life in the way it did for us.
There are many questions I'm dying to ask, but I think I'll concentrate on the ones that have come through the chat. A question about, yes, whether your parents ever returned to Poland.
In 1990, they were officially invited to, after the thawing, after the Solidarność and change, the fall of communism, they were officially invited to come back, and my father was officially invited to take back his post at the Polish Academy of Sciences. They declined. Again, that dignity, that dignity which led a lot of the decision that they took in their lives. But having said that, we all began to go back to Poland regularly. They loved Poland. I mean, they loved being there, and they remained for forever their native country, their motherland, really. So it was special to go back there, but certainly not in any permanent way.
And I think perhaps, sadly, one needs to add that towards the end of your father's life, he was getting some pretty nasty comments on social media and various other channels, directed at him as a Jew in Poland.
Yes,
being
I did mean to say that in that exhibition at the Museum of Jewish Life, commemorating the 50th anniversary of 1968, the very last exhibit was a board on which people could post their own comments about that story. And I have to say that the anti-Semitic expressions about antisemitism were very much on a par with the very same ones which led to our expulsion from Poland. So the whole thing, as you know, is coming back in circles. Yeah.
Sadly. There's a nice question I want to end with, but I wonder if I could just take the liberty, or not to take the prerogative of asking a question myself now. We haven't had a chance to have any taste of your own wonderful artwork as a painter primarily, but I think I can safely say that there are no direct references in it to your family's complex history. And yet I know that Griselda Pollock, for one, and I to some extent feel that there is something in your work that is, in part at least, consciously or otherwise, a response to that history. And I just wondered if you'd like to say a little bit about that.
Well, when I had one of my returns to Poland was to have a major exhibition in Warsaw, in a place called Zachęta, which is a major gallery there. And the critics had written that it is clearly the work of an artist without a homeland, because quite often featuring in the middle of my landscapes might be a small house to which there's no obvious path leading, and which is inaccessible because the doors are closed and the windows are sort of blind. I never saw it as such, but of course it's not my job to interpret my paintings. I just paint them, and it's the job of critics, including someone like Griselda Pollock, to say things which they feel these works contain. I was never conscious of that myself. But as I say, that's who's to say what subconscious things might be leading somebody to put a brush to canvas or panel, in my case, and paint something.
There's a question from somebody called Jane. Thank you so much, Lydia. How did your mother's story come to light? I think you did touch on that, but at what point did she feel able to share her story with you? And perhaps I can just add on the back of that, I'm curious to know whether your relationship with her changed as she was in the process of writing the books. Did something shift? Did something change?
Well, when she was writing the books, I was already not living at home, so I wasn't actually privy to that process. The reason that she began, the way that the whole story became finally known to me, because apart from these two incidents in Poland with the rosary and the waiting outside the doctor's office where she told me part of their childhood story, I had nothing since. And she never spoke about it. She was driven to write the first book, Winter in the Morning, when her mother, who came to live with us, died. And this sort of spurred her on to remember and think. And once she began that process, it all began to flood back. And the extraordinary details, the extraordinary kind of fine detail of what she's describing in the book really shows that the memory certainly works pretty well if you finally stimulate it. And so that's when I really heard the story properly, by reading it. And my mother did, by all accounts, I know that she became much relieved by unburdening herself finally. And of course, it gave her a very particular and new identity, because she became the kind of the person to interview about the Holocaust, and she began to give interviews and travel with lectures and appearances and things like that. So it was a very important moment in her life, and she was in her 50s when she began to write. She didn't have a job in Leeds. Well, she had a job. She worked in a comprehensive school library. Yeah.
We could carry on, but I suspect we should begin to draw things to a close. Two lovely comments, I think, with which it might be appropriate to close. One from Anne Hyatt King. Oh, Lydia, ... pause, and so close to us in time and place. Thank you for sharing your family story. May it keep repetition at bay, please. And then from somebody called Joe, it's hard to understand that despite atrocities by Nazis against the Jewish people during the war, that so soon afterwards Jewish people should once again be persecuted. Well, what can one say? History does have a horrible habit of repeating itself, I think, particularly in the Polish, really disturbingly in the Polish context. We did have another question which actually has some bearing on that. Did your parents ever experience any form of anti-Semitism in this country?
Only from Poles,
Yeah, okay.
including myself in the Polish Cultural Center. On the occasion of a small exhibition I had there with some other Polish artists. No, it was when the more recent unpleasant developments against my father started in Poland. There was one occasion where I think our house was sort of not so much burgled but entered. It was obviously somebody sent by by the Polish government, I think, to rummage through things and take away certain documents. And on one occasion, the house in Leeds was splattered with red paint when they were away on a lecturing trip. But whatever happened always happened from the Polish angle and never from the English public.
And yes, I think it's true to say, is it not, that they never felt totally at home here. I mean, your mother writes very eloquently about that. It's that insider-outsider belonging and yet not belonging dichotomy that still prevails. I think you'll agree. Very good. Well, I think we probably ought to draw things to a close. We've got lots of lovely comments. I'll send you the chat, the transcript of the chat. Lydia, with a great pleasure. But as a parting shot from Ginny Woodrow, we're lucky to have you here. How lovely. I completely agree. Okay, well, thank you all very much for your questions, for being here in such large numbers as well. Just to remind you, I know there are some people who would have liked to be here but couldn't, perhaps some of your friends among them. The recording has been taking place, as far as I can tell, technology permitting, and we'll make sure that the recording is uploaded onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel as soon as humanly possible within the next few days, certainly within the next week or so. So look out for that. Also, if you're interested in both past recordings, as I mentioned, the YouTube channel now has, I think, a rich, it's a rich resource of interesting material, including talks by members of the second and even the third generation. And on that subject, I'd like to alert you, if I may, as a parting shot, to the fact that next month, as you probably know, is middle of the month is Refugee Week 2021, and we've made a special effort to put together, again, a diverse range of events to coincide with Refugee Week, which are, you can see for yourselves in the What's On section of the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website. But among them, in fact, on the 7th, don't want to get the dates wrong, I think on the 7th, which is also a Monday, very much this Monday evening, we'll actually have Julia Neuberger, wonderful Julia Neuberger, talking about a new book about her mother. And then on the 14th, we'll have two very different talks, but also with a very strong family connection. One of them is by a woman who lives partly in Israel, partly in Vienna, but whose father was an eminent anthropologist and lawyer who made a life for himself, having been born in Berlin in Australia. So it becomes very international indeed. And also at 8 o'clock that evening on the 14th, what promises to be a very poignant and I think rather special talk by a very young emerging poet called Maya Elsner about her grandfather, who was in fact a Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor. So do take a look at what's on the website there, and even better, perhaps sign up to the newsletter, which you can find if you scroll to the very bottom right of each page on the website. You can do that very easily. Good, Lydia, thank you very much indeed. Once again, wonderful, touching, everything I expected. And everybody, I hope to see you again, perhaps on other occasions, but in the meantime, a very good night and thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.